college football a little bit over the past few shows here. But some new news happened this week that you guys may have heard about, but you probably haven't looked at the implications of it on the conference side. And what I'm talking about is the college football playoff. So when the college football playoff was implemented a few years ago and they decided to go from 4 teams to 12 teams, it was ultimately decided that it would be a 6+6 model. That means that 6 conference championships would get automatic bids into the 12-team playoff, and then the remaining 6 spots would come from automatic qualifying bids. So essentially what would happen is the top 6 ranked conference championships would get in, and then they would pick 6 other teams that were higher ranked in the polls. And what that meant was that the Power Fives essentially were going to always get a slot. Whoever won a Power 5 conference, we're talking ACC, SEC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12. And then one of the group of 5s would also get a spot, whoever's the highest ranked, and the rest would be filled out from, multiple SEC teams, Big 10 teams, et cetera. You guys get the point. But with the Pac-12 imploding over the last year, and obviously that conference going away with only 2 teams now, they're not eligible to hold a conference championship. So it made sense to get rid of that conference championship as part of the automatic qualifying thing. And the conference, the playoff committee ended up voting on this over the last week, and they changed it from a 6+6 model to a 5+7 model. So now it opens up the door for one more automatic qualifier or an at-large bid based on one less conference championship. That's all great. I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're the Pac-12, you weren't going to be getting in anyways. So now you opened up a door for one of those 2 teams to potentially get in anyways. And that's why they ended up voting for it. And at the end of the day, there's still going to be a slot that all of the group of 5 players, all the group of 5 teams are going to be going for as well. So no arguments there. We still have a lot to figure out with the college football playoff. Financials, revenue sharing, voting, all of that stuff is still up in the air. I do think it's going to get figured out. There's an offer from ESPN on the table for $1.3 billion a year to broadcast this 12-team playoff, 11 games a year, incredibly lucrative. That's about $115, $120 million per game per year, which again is roughly equal to what the NFL paid or what the NFL got in return from Peacock for their exclusive NFL playoff game. So it's a great deal for the college football playoff. I think it's a good deal for ESPN too, because they're locking up some premium rights. But more importantly, I want to talk about this because one of the more important issues from this past week got swept under the rug. And I'm specifically talking about Florida State. So anyone that has followed college football over the last few years knows that there's been immense movement on the conference realignment side. Obviously, the Pac-12 essentially imploded and a bunch of those teams went to different conferences. But the ACC, in my opinion, could face some trouble too. And what we've seen on this front is that Florida State filed a lawsuit. And essentially, it boils down to the fact that they're trying to get out of their media rights deal with the ACC. So the way that this works is the ACC signed an agreement with ESPN to broadcast all of their football teams' games. And as part of that agreement, the Florida State and all of the other ACC schools signed a grant of rights. And essentially what the grant of rights allows them to do is they give their broadcast rights. They sign over their broadcast rights to the ACC. The ACC then goes out and packages all those up and sells them to a network as part of a broadcasting deal. The problem is that with the Big 10 and the SEC getting stronger over the last 2 years by conference realignment, they went out and they signed more lucrative TV deals, which are going to pay teams in their conference more money than Florida State is going to be getting paid going forward. Now, the reason why this is so important for Florida State is because Florida State is a good football school. They're one of the few teams to win a national championship over the last decade or so. And what we've seen is now with the money being split by various different counterparties, Florida State says that they will be down about $20 million per year to the higher earning teams across the Big 10 and the SEC. Now, $20 million in the grand scheme of things is still a lot of money. I mean, that's a huge sum of money when it comes to some of these athletic department budgets, and specifically speaking of the football program. So Florida State is saying this is going to put them at a disadvantage when it comes to facilities, coaches, NIL, and everything else in between. Down $20 million can make a difference. And to be honest, I kind of agree with that, right? The idea that they should be earning less money than Rutgers or Vanderbilt simply because they're in a different conference doesn't make a lot of sense. That's the agreement they signed, and that's the agreement that they're in with the ACC and ESPN. So they filed this lawsuit, and they're trying to get out of the grant of rights. This has been an uphill battle. Multiple people have talked about that are much smarter than me on the law side, saying that this is ironclad. There's no way they're going to be able to get out of it. And if they want to leave, they're going to have to pay upwards of $600 million to get out of it. And that $600 million consists of a few different things. It consists of the media rights that they're going to forgo. It consists of a contract breakup fee that I think is like $130 million. And then they have to cover legal fees and everything else too. So that $600 million would be a huge hit. Florida State has talked about raising private equity money to be able to fund that. They could go the SMU route, which was essentially them raising money from boosters to be able to get out of a media deal or forfeit some of the money and get some of that back through the booster money. But I don't think Florida State's going to be able to do that because it's just such a wild sum of money. And that's part of the reason why the agreement with the ACC was considered ironclad. Because instead of this agreement going till 2030 or 2034, like the deal does with the SEC and the Big Ten. This deal goes, I think it's until 2034. Or 2036, which is even further down the road. So they're in this for the long haul. When it was signed, it was like a 10-year deal with another 10-year extension. And ESPN is most likely going to pick that up as long as the conference is intact. But this week, what happened was that the ACC responded to Florida State's lawsuit. And I don't want to read you guys all of the legal jargon, but what you need to know is they essentially opened the door for Florida State to come to them and negotiate an agreement for them to exit this contract. And really what that means is that the ACC could potentially be willing to accept a sum of money that is less than the $600 million fee that they would have to forego to get out of this contract. So again, we're talking wide ranges here, but just think about it in the terms of more than zero, less than 600 million. So there's a wide gap there. But at the end of the day, this is huge because if Florida State finds a way out of this contract, this could be detrimental to the life of the ACC going forward. And I know that, and I'm saying that confidently because Clemson, UNC, Florida State, Miami, NC State, Virginia, and Virginia Tech, those 7 ACC schools met last year talking about how they could potentially get out of this media rights deal. And if Florida State finds a way to get out of this deal, you can guarantee all of those other schools, specifically speaking, Clemson, who dominates across college football over the last decade, and other schools too that are even big in basketball. I mean, we're talking about UNC, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech here. These are good schools. They could find other homes across different conferences across the country. So I think that's going to open the door for other teams to leave. And ultimately, if Florida State leaves, ESPN might end up pulling this deal anyways from the ACC, and that can make a drastic difference in the overall numbers from a competitive standpoint of what these schools are getting paid. And if that deal is gone, then these teams may be able to leave a little bit more freely. So I was shocked to see that the ACC would be willing to potentially negotiate this. Now, there may be some other things going on under the surface here, but Florida State would be wise to look into this and potentially negotiate with them and find an alternative solution to the lawsuit. Because if you think about the lawsuit, this is at least going to be going on for the next 2 years. And even best case scenario, Florida State wins the lawsuit, which is they get out of the deal entirely and they are free to go sign with another conference and they get their media rights back. Best case scenario. The ACC is obviously going to appeal that, and it could be tied up for another 2 years. And then we're talking about, 4 years down the line, 2028 at this point, where they're going to have to go find a new conference from there. Now, it's unclear where they would go if they were to leave the ACC. Obviously, the SEC would make a lot of sense. They have Florida, their in-state rival, and it makes sense from a geographic perspective as well. But maybe the Big Ten wants to add them. And ultimately, what I think is going to happen here is I've talked about this at length now. We're going to see a more professional model enter the collegiate sports atmosphere, specifically when it comes to football by itself. And the reason I think that is because if the Big Ten and the SEC were to come to some agreement to join forces of some sort, they would have the best teams in the country. They would be able to negotiate better media rights than anyone else because they would have this closed-end ecosystem in the college football atmosphere to operate out of, and they would enhance the amount of money that they're able to get from each team. So if Florida State was to leave the ACC, they would go join one of those conferences and it would only enhance that argument even more. That's to be determined, though. This is the first step in that process, albeit it could potentially be a big one, because if Florida State leaves the ACC could crumble altogether. And it's certainly something, as a fan of college football or as a fan of college sports in general, if you're aligned to a certain conference because your team plays in that conference, it's something you should be watching. Conference realignment is not over with. And ultimately, the rules that the College Football Playoff Committee just voted on could get changed within the next year if something happens on this front.